Hello, everyone, and welcome to Always Choose Orange, the show that provides actionable ways to develop and maintain a thriving creative process. Today's guest is Simon Van Boy, the award-winning best-selling author of more than a dozen books for adults and children, including The Illusion of Separateness, The Presence of Absence, and most recently, Sipsworth. Simon is the editor of three books of philosophy and has written for the New York Times, the Financial Times, the Washington Post, and the BBC. Raised in North Wales, he currently lives in New York, where he's also a book editor and a volunteer E.M.T crew chief. Simon, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Alex. Nice to be here.
So, the first question that I have is what are some of the ways your story ideas come to you?
Uh, well, usually it just comes out of nowhere. Like I'm driving, maybe I'll see like a dead animal at the side of the road, and then I'll think about like the soul of that animal, and I'll think of maybe other people driving past and somebody feels sorry for it, and the person they're with in the car doesn't care, and so they realize it's sort of a bad relationship, so they break up with that person. But then maybe later the person comes back and says like, you were right about the dead animals.
Mhm.
They matter. And then that's the end of it. That's the short story. So that occurred to me a few weeks ago when I was driving past a dead deer, the side of the road. And so really it can come from anything. It can come from reading the ingredients on a bubble gum wrapper, or it can come from something you see on a TV commercial. You know you're a writer when you cry at toilet paper ads. Yeah.
Yes.
Uh, but so anything really. And then you sort of just sit down and just sort of tease it out. And I write really, really quickly on a typewriter and I don't stop and edit. Otherwise, like dun dun dun, the self-critic comes out. Like those two old men in the Muppets at the top. You know. So so it's really important to get like maybe really a first draft done before you really stop and think too much. And then when you've got the first draft, that's when the magic can start to happen.
Once you have the first draft and
Mm.
you have it typewritten, how do
Yeah.
you approach editing that? Then do you transfer it from do you take your typewritten manuscript and then type it to the computer, or are you still working like hand editing at that point?
It's a really laborious process, and it takes such an enormous amount of time. Like I don't really have time to go out to have a social life. Like I rarely eat in restaurants because once you've worked like emotionally you're just spent. So I actually hand edit those pages and then I type them into the computer, and then when I'm typing them into the computer I get another edit. So I get the first draft and then I hand edit and then I type it into the computer, but when I'm typing it in I'm changing it again. So that's like the second, the third. So it's like by the time I've typed it into the computer, it's the fourth draft.
Okay. Were you always using typewriters, or is that something you discovered along the way as more beneficial to your process?
Yeah, more beneficial. I mean, I was able to type on a computer, but the thing is, like the final draft and the first draft are so different and they both look the same on the computer, that it's really disheartening to know that you've just got to go through, you have to stare at a computer for that long. So I like a typewriter because I can't get distracted by, what if like there's a volcanic eruption a few miles away? I'd better check the internet, or then I'll get some sort of weird pop-up to tell me that like, bras are on sale. Do I need a new bra? And then I'll be distracted. So typewriter helps me because also I look at my fingers when I'm typing as opposed to looking at what I'm writing. So I find that not looking at what I'm writing is more beneficial.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense because I've sort of found that the medium sort of shapes the almost shapes the prose in a way too, and that typewriter is very, you have to be a lot more methodical because the speed is sort of inhibited by the keys and stuff. Do you find that to be true when you used to experiment with other mediums?
Yeah, it's slower. I mean, for sure, it's slower, like working on a typewriter.
Yeah.
you know.
Once you get these initial ideas, like you mentioned, they can come from anywhere. Do you typically, and I'm sure it varies, but do you typically let them sit for a while, or once you have an idea, do you sort of ride that momentum and start fleshing things out more or outlining or anything before you start, or do you just jump in?
If I'm emotionally connected, when I've typed it into well, actually, as I'm typing it into the computer, I do a chapter outline. I can actually show you.
Yeah.
So it's this sort of thing.
Oh, cool. Okay. Oh, we're getting blurred a little bit. Oh, there we go. I think. Okay, cool. That's fascinating. So
Just
that's an
like,
outline of all the chapters.
yeah, and I do that because I could just spend basically years just writing different scenes that will never really that writing different scenes about the characters or their childhoods or things like that, like literally hundreds of pages. But the fact is, like, I have a deadline to hand the book in. So I've got to figure out what is the story. And then I have to make sure that my chapters focus on scenes that are relevant to the story. So many, I mean, I work as a book editor too. And my most uphill battle with working with writers is convincing them that these scenes that they've written, which are really well written, are just slowing the pacing of the book because they're not directly relevant to the story. And that good writing is not enough to sell a book. You
Right.
have to have a really strong story arc. Even, if you go into Barnes and Noble, like, or, and pick any like random book up, you might be horrified by the quality of the prose, how low it is.
Yeah.
But the fact is, the person who wrote that must be brilliant at story arc. Uh,
Yes.
and so, I work with a lot of writers who are talented and they write beautifully, but they simply won't concede the fact that today you need to have a really strong story concept or idea. I mean, then in the US, the quality of the writing is secondary to the idea almost. Whereas if you were writing in Ireland, of course, it's different. The quality of the writing is held, in much higher sort of, so uh, that's the hard thing is working with writers is convincing them that they have to actually do something that's not that hard. It's just come up with a really good story idea, but there's this idea that like it's all about the writing, and
Mm.
James Joyce said it's not what you write, it's how you write. And that's certainly the true, but for the writers I work with, I don't even want to entertain those conversations until we've got a really strong story arc in place.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Um, yeah, let's see. There was something that just sparked that I was going to ask. Okay, so when you are editing your own work, because you've been doing this, for a long time and have written a lot of books, do you find that you are cutting down when you go from your first to second and third draft, or are you expanding at that point? Because I know it's different for everyone, right? For me, I'm usually expanding because I underwrite. Do you find that you lean one way or the other?
Well, I'm in the first draft, I'm usually just throwing everything out there. Neil Gaiman said you're just sort of throwing everything onto the wall to see what sticks. And so by the thing is the reason I don't take I get through a first draft quickly is because one never knows what the story's going to end up being.
Hmm.
So if you manicure early chapters too much, then you're working on things and getting attached to scenes that you'll be much more reluctant to cut later if you find that they don't quite fit into the story arc. And that means that the pacing will suffer and that the book probably won't sell.
Yeah.
So I always, even though there's no pleasure really in a first draft, except the fact that you put the time in, the pleasure of getting the sentence right, choosing words, idioms, not idioms, sorry, metaphors, and, just those wonderful moments of dialogue when the reader knows something the characters don't. That is all post 10th draft now for me. Even though I would love from day one to start enjoying, being in the trenches of that type of, pr part of the process, I know that it will just add a year to the book.
Hmm.
And I'll get attached to scenes then that I'll have to cut because I don't know how the book's going to end until I've got to a first draft. So it's hard and it's painful and it's torture, but I think you know you get to a first draft and then you cut anything, you make the story outline, and you make sure it's really ruthlessly good.
Mm.
Meaning like you're not using up people's time because you think it's important that they learn about something that happened. I'm sort of I've turned against backstory over the
Mm.
last 5 years. It's good for the writer to know, but I think the problem is if what's happening in the backstory competes with what's happening in the main story, and then the reader can't fully commit to the main story because part of them wants to be with the backstory. So backstory, of course, and summary are normal in a first draft, which is why writing one is so unsatisfying.
Mm.
But as you get closer and closer in, I mean, I tell writers like you're really not any of the genius that is you is not going to be fully unleashed until at least the 10th draft.
Mm.
You'll see
Um,
flashes of it early on, but it won't. It's almost like you, Alex, are an elite athlete. Actually, you look really fit. So this is a bad metaphor. But say that you weren't fit at all. Maybe you were like, what do they say? Like, I don't know, but say you're not fit and you want to be an ultra marathon runner, which is say a 100-mile race. So actually, no, say you want to be in the Tour de France, the cycling event.
okay.
So the fact is, if you're unfit, then 90% of the next 2 years is going to be taken up getting to a level of fitness where you can compete. But the thing is, even if you have that level of fitness, you're still not going to be able to win without the techniques of how to learn how to ride in the peloton, how to ride in a team, how to pace yourself. So that comes last. So until you've built up that 90% of core fitness, you see what I mean? You're not going to, and that's really what a first draft is. It's not personal. It's anyone can do it if they
Yeah.
put the time and they work on the nutrition. It's that last 10% where you've got that core fitness and then you start applying your own personality to the world of bike racing. That's when you're going to win. But there's no way you can even start to think about that until you have a first draft.
Mm. That's so good. How many drafts do you typically go through?
Probably about between 30 and 50.
Wow. Okay.
Um, so, really, it's just laborious. And, imagine that I'm an interior decorator and I specialize in paint and lighting and placement of pictures on walls, right? But I have to be, my job starts when the ground is chosen and then the foundation is dug and then this concrete is poured. So I don't really get to do my thing until like 2 years later.
Yeah.
But I have to stay inspired for watching the frame go up, watching the
Mm.
concrete go in, watching the drywall, the wires, the plumbing. And I think that's why most writers who are talented don't publish a book, in my experience, is because they finish a one room of the house and start decorating, and the rest of the room, the rest of the house is still unframed.
Mm.
Water's getting in. So the tolerance for a first draft, I think, is something that distinguishes a professional writer from an amateur.
Right, right. That makes a ton of sense. And do you find that over the years, like looking back at like the first things that you wrote up until now, do you feel like it got any easier and you learned anything that helped you do that, or is it still kind of excruciating in some ways?
Well, it's always excruciating, because every book is different.
Yeah.
Like getting into a new relationship with someone. You've learned stuff from the old relationship. You know that you shouldn't like whistle because it usually irritates people. But you also have to, it's a new person you're getting to know with their own idiosyncrasies. I'd say what I've learned primarily falls into the context of being an editor. And that is that, if I look at my own career as 15 books as a book editor, objectively, then I see that my early works were very short stories.
Mm.
And I was able to have full control over like the plot and the pacing because they were only 5 pages long. And then as soon as and then those books sold quite well from a, commercial point of view. But then as soon as I moved into novels, my sales sort of dropped off a cliff a bit.
Mm.
And that's because I was trading on my writing style and I wasn't giving enough thought to pacing and plot and characterization. So I would always sell books because I have a readership and some people like my writing style. But the fact is, my novels were lacking something which I now feel is integral to the, experience for the reader of having a novel in their hands. And you learn over the years. And so what I've realized now is that I can keep selling books based on my writing style, and have a fantastic readership, or I can do what I learned to do with my last book, Sipsworth, and that is to really, really focus on story arc, story outline, and then focus on the writing, which is what
Mhm.
I did. And so as a book editor, I've seen an uptick in attention and sales. And most importantly, the experience for the reader is deeper and more fulfilling. And of course, that's my goal, really. After I've satisfied my own self as a writer, what I mean is using writing as a kind of medicine for myself, then to see other people satisfied from it, that is enormously, um, it's enormously encouraging. So, yeah, I think I have learned things. And the novel and the short story are very, very different. And if you get a basketball player who's really good at at layups. They can't rely on just layups in the
Mhm.
NBA. You have to work on where you're weak. And I've realized that's what separates, again, the professional from the amateur is the professional at some point faces their weakest points and says, right, we've got to get this up to the level of the stuff I'm good at. And then everything sort of rises then. And what they are good at, they're able to, you know, do more of because they're working on a stronger foundation.
When you started realizing those things, what sort of sparked like I would imagine for some of us it's hard to see our weaknesses at times because we're so close to our work. Like what do you feel like allowed you to notice those things and see it that objectively? And then what did you do? Did you consciously say like with Sipsworth, okay, I'm really gonna lock in and architect the story and make it really tight?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, as a book editor, I sit in on business meetings and I talk to people in sales and in marketing, and I talk to librarians and I talk to booksellers, and all really, the book industry is full of really good people. And I talk to readers. And so as a book editor, when I'm editing someone, I'm thinking, there's a weak part here. But then when I'm working on my own work, I realize like I'm guilty of that same thing. Like I'm attached to something and I don't want to cut it, even though it doesn't really, really fit in with the story arc now, since the book changed. So what I'm asking my writers to do, I end up having to tell myself to do. So, they say if you want to learn something, teach it. So, because then you're forced to learn, so that you don't look foolish in the classroom. And so, as a book editor, I really learned a lot about being on both sides. And I know writers you have to manage carefully because you can push them to a point where they like, you know.
Right. No, that makes a lot of sense. So, with the structure of your books, as you're mentioning, and like paying attention to that, there's been so many unique structures that you've used. So I think of Sipsworth having the days of the week, and it's like that 3 week period, and then the presence of absence, where the chapters go in reverse, which I thought was really a really cool way of approaching the story and like showing that sort of time being limited feel. And then something like the illusion of separateness, where it's almost like a mosaic type story. At what point does the structure become clear to you? Is that around the first draft time when you're doing these chapter outlines, or do you sometimes write the drafts and go, oh, this actually needs to be structured completely different based on what the draft is like? I'm just super curious about that because you've explored so many different
Yeah.
structures.
Well, I suppose it's different with every book. But yeah, with the presence of absence, I really sort of lost faith in sort of the publishing industry. And so I said, I'm just going to write a book that I want. I'm just going to write exactly what I want, and just with complete carte blanche. This is a book for me and for my reader. And it's a strange book. It's only about 19,000 words. Um, but I really, really just let loose on the page and found it enormously satisfying to write, and it was really a what great experience for me. And it's not for everybody. For really a minority of readers. But I think the readers who are attracted to that book get it. So it's very much a book that only a very small number of people are going to get.
Mm.
But that's a book for us, for me and my closest readers. Whereas Sipsworth is a book I think that it's more accessible because it uses more of the traditional what you'd expect in a novel. And so Sipsworth was the first book where I really put my experience as a book editor into practice for myself by, setting it no flashbacks, chronological, and present tense, just one or two main characters. And so, yeah, I feel like people are really enjoying it, which makes me very happy. But also it makes Simon the editor happy because his advice, Simon the writer took Simon the editor's advice and it worked out.
I love that. That's amazing. No, it is. I just read it like a month ago and I really enjoyed it too. It is very different than some of your other work and um it's cool to see just the experimentation and doing different things. Like that's something that me and I'm sure a lot of people value in like the, authors and creators and stuff that they love is like being willing to do something completely different than you've ever done
Mm.
before. So that's super cool. Um Another question that I have is I know a number of your stories are based on real stories or events that you've heard before. And I was just curious, like, how you navigate that. So, what conversations you need to have with the people whose story it is? Do you have conversations with it? Just sort of that whole world of taking a real thing and fictionalizing it. I'm just wondering if you could speak a little bit to what that's been like.
Yeah, that's I live in New York at the moment, and but wherever I live, I like to go out usually for breakfast. I used to when I was in my 20s, I would go out at night, wander the streets like a flaneur, but or something else. And but now I'm a sort of a morning. The older I get, the more I become a morning person. I think it's normal as you go into middle age, and so I go out for breakfast, and I overhear things. This morning, I heard about somebody was telling the waitress that a woman, Jackie, was just killed in the Bronx, and it was a month after her daughter killed herself. And then the guy went, her boyfriend went after her husband or whatever, went after the guy who killed her, and ended up getting like arrested and put in jail by police. So, and then she said, yeah, the girl's father works here. He runs the fruit stand. And the waitress said, "What, the guy with grey hair?" And the woman said, "Yeah." And I thought, ooh, that's the character right there. He's lost his daughter, he's lost his granddaughter, and his son-in-law has gone to jail. And he's in his 70s and he's still working like really long, hard hours. Now that's the story.
Okay.
So he might be a character. So I might not say what happened to his family. He might just have an interaction with someone on the street as a short story. But of course, if it was to be a novel, then there would have to be character development. So he might not be as good a character for that. So, I just sort of overhear things, eavesdrop. I spend probably about uh, 15 hours a day, 16 hours a day with earplugs in. Actually, I have some here.
Yeah. Okay.
And I go through these like, a kid and candy. And so I sleep with them in, and I also write. I don't take them out when I wake up, and get round down to writing. And then when I finish writing, I take them out. So I probably wear them for like, yeah, probably 15 hours a day. And so my hearing, though, when I take them out is really good
Oh,
because I think I'm
wow.
wearing earplugs for most of my life. So if somebody's having a conversation at a table, I can often hear it. And, I just pretend I can't, because that's what writers do. But then I'm secretly thinking, oh yeah, there's a character there. Hmm.
Okay. What is it just kind of a preference thing? Like you like the quiet and the stillness? Does it help you focus or
I think there's something wrong with me, to be honest, because since I was a child,
yeah.
I just can't. If I get overstimulated, I just feel enormously angry and discouraged, and I have to go into a room, close the door, shut the curtains, be in the dark. I have to, they come, I have a limit. I saw
Yeah.
a therapist, and the therapist said, Simon, if you're at a dinner party or something, you can stand up and say, well, everybody, I've had a lovely time and now I'm going, bye. And she said, you can just walk out. So I've been practicing that. But
Yeah.
people are not shocked if you get up and say, well, but bye, everybody, I'm going. And then you just leave. I haven't found a way to do that, like, so it's seamless.
Right. That that makes a lot of sense. Um, how many projects do you work on multiple projects at a time, or when you're working on something like a novel, are you locked in on that one novel until it's complete?
Yeah, I'm locked in on that one novel. So, a normal day, I teach 1 day a week at an art school because I dropped out of 3 universities and then found art school, which is full of sort of society's exiles. And so I teach at an art school, well, just 1 day a week. So Tuesday through Friday, I wake up at about 8 o'clock, and then I make a cup of tea, and then I work for an hour, and then I make a protein smoothie, and then I work for another hour, and then I make some toast and maybe an egg, and then I work for another hour, and then I work till about noon,
Okay.
and then I don't check my email or even look at my phone till about noon, and then noon to 1, I have a bath or do some reading or go to the gym. And then at 1 o'clock, I check my email. So I only check my email between 1 p.m. and like 7 p.m. So only 6 hours a day. Um, and then I work with my clients whose books I'm the editor of, and I work with them, until about 4 or 5 o'clock, and then answer any business emails from my own editor. But things sort of tick along seamlessly now because I've been doing it for so long. It's just things like covers and contracts and things like that. And then I finish work about 6 o'clock, 5, 6 o'clock, and then I really don't know what to do with myself. So I usually end up like watching television.
Okay. Yeah. When you're working on something, like you said, and you're focused on that one thing, I would
Yeah.
imagine maybe you're still, going out at some point and hearing conversations and having ideas for other characters and stuff. Do you file that away for the future? Do you write notes to yourself to track that thing, that type of stuff?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, the Dead Deer at the Side of the Road, I'm deep into a novel at the moment, and I'm not going to finish until probably March or April. And so the Dead Deer story has to be filed away. But when I come to it later, if I still have the same inspiration for it, I don't know.
Mm.
Um, and so the thing is, you just have to let some ideas go. But the thing is, I always advise writers, if you're working on something that you're really into, just let the other ideas go. But if you're not working on anything, then you've been given a gift, a new idea.
Have you ever not completed a book because of for some reason? Like, have you ever had to set down a project or
Yeah.
not released a book
Once.
that you've written? Okay.
Actually, my first 2 novels, um, I finished, but I never sold, and I gave up working on them because, after writing them, I had enough experience to know why they would never sell.
Mm.
Because they just wouldn't be good experiences for the reader. They would be unsatisfying. So, but writing those, they're my two most important novels, The Harmony of the Spheres and The Man Who Followed His Shadow. And those books will now, I know they sound okay, right? But they'll never come out because they're the books that taught me how to write.
Mm.
So even though those books will never get published, my entire career is built on 2 books that will never get published. I couldn't have
Okay.
done anything I've done without those 2 novels. So in many ways, they're the most important novels of my career, even though they're commercial and artistic failures.
Yeah. Okay, so then was that sort of when you were learning the bridge between like a short story and a novel? Is that kind of what you felt like
Yeah.
wasn't working?
Yeah, and also just you know, you're just writing,
Hmm.
and you don't really get a sense of what's really sort of going on. Because it's almost like when you're in an emergency, you get tunnel vision. But after you've been in many emergencies, you're able to just like breathe and look around and everything sort of slows down and then you can manage the scene, much more successfully than when you're first in an emergency. Like if you stop at a car accident to help and there's just like bodies everywhere and it's like you get tunnel vision and everything feels like it's not happening fast enough. But when
Mm.
you get on like 30, 40 car accident scenes, then you're able to be like, okay, so if there's a hand there, there's probably someone who needs a tourniquet over there. And this car's not too badly damaged. There's people moving. You just sort of, you're able to just be much calmer. So the more you write, the more you will learn how to manage prose.
Mm.
So when I say to people like, the most important prose you will ever write will be artistic failure, artistically flawed and commercially unsellable. But you can't do anything without it. So that's why for young writers that they're at the hardest point in their careers because they're going through this initiation process. Most, I mean, somebody said to me like, I'm not sure I'm going to survive this initiation. They said I'm not sure I can be a writer. And I said, well, just try not being one.
Yeah.
Try not writing and just see how you feel. So if regardless of you fail forever, you still do it, you won't fail forever because it means you're really a writer because you can't not do it. It's like a sort of a disease, an obsession.
Right. Oh yeah. No, that's exactly how it feels. Something that you just mentioned that sparked a thought that I've always been curious about as well. You were talking about sort of like going to the scene of an accident and all that stuff. What parts of have you ever been writing something and then said, I need to learn more about this. I want to go do it. Like, have you ever had to go out and live something
Yeah,
that you
all the
wanted to write
time.
about? Okay.
In fact, it's how I would justify spending money on seemingly stupid things. So one of my characters was walking around Sweden in the winter in a pair of velvet slippers. And I thought, well, I'd better do that. And so I used what small money I had from my first advance to fly to Stockholm for like 4 days in the winter and buy a pair of velvet slippers on my when I changed planes in London. And I got to walk around Stockholm in velvet slippers. And does the reader read that story and say, wow, now that it's so lifelike? I really felt like I was walking in Stockholm in velvet slippers. No, they just say, oh, that was an interesting story. But I needed to do that myself. So some of the things that you'll need to do creatively, you'll feel like they're vital to the story. You'll tell yourself that they are. But what
Mm,
you're really doing is something very strange and mysterious that artists do which no one in the world will understand. Even the artist won't understand it. And it will seem eccentric to everyone, but it's part of the process.
yeah.
So indulge.
I love that so much. What parts of is there anything in your creative process that you feel like other writers would look at and say, wow, that's unorthodox or strange?
Hmm. Yeah, I think some writers would look at the way I do a chapter outline for the sense of, selling a book and making the story arc really, really ruthlessly tight. I think some writers would say, you're going to lose the soul of the writing, which is in the writing. And then I think some writers would say, you should start off with a story outline. Forget about the soul of the writing. You've got to have a good story arc. So I suppose it depends. I'm a great believer in moderation. You can do anything you want, but just do it in moderation. So maybe that's a very British way of looking at things. But yeah, I'd say that every writer's different. I mean, one of my friends, she writes in a very peculiar way. She writes a chapter, works on it, works on it, works on it, works on it, to the point where she's got like through 30 drafts of one chapter one. And then it's like she locks the room and that's it, it's done.
Mm,
And she never goes back to it.
wow.
And then she
Right.
just finishes the book. And then as soon as she's finished the last chapter, the book is done. She doesn't go back to chapter one in the light of what she's learned at the end of the book. So then she must know exactly what she wants to write about. It's very interesting. Her books are very good, but very peculiar way of writing.
Yeah. That's so fascinating. Do you ex Do you have any interest in experimenting like yourself, like trying alternate ways of doing it, or is it like you've got to the point where I know the way that works for me, I'm going to stick doing this?
Well, every book is it has some element of experimentation because the story, the characters are different. It's like being in a new relationship, really. Um, and hard thing is being in a relationship with characters you don't like,
Hmm.
particularly, but you have to write them and spend years with them. That's horrible.
Okay,
Mm.
so when you first were inspired to write, what types of were you inspired most by poetry or short stories or
Poetry, yeah.
novels?
Poetry, and I would have stayed with poetry if I was independently wealthy. Like, I wasn't born into any kind of wealth or anything, so I've always had to work since I was very young.
Okay.
Um, just to support myself. When I left home, when I left school at 16, I worked, and I liked it. I liked working, and I liked being with working people and working in factories and stuff. But I suppose that what was the question again?
Yeah, I was just curious about what inspired you initially? Like, was it what about writing sort of like was it poetry? Was it short
Oh
stories? Was
yeah.
it novels? And
So
yeah, what kind of really helped you love it?
yeah, so really poetry. I mean, yeah, really poetry. And so if I had a trust, I know Roald Dahl had a trust fund, and he started off as a short story writer. And so if I had anything like that, um, I would have just written poetry for my whole life and tried to eke out a sort of career as a poet, with or without teaching, because a lot of poets have professorships. But yeah, because I just find poetry so enormously satisfying to read and to write. It's so difficult and so wonderful to wrestle with a poem. But then, I moved on to short stories and I wrote those. And then eventually I realized I could probably have a career as a writer, but if I wanted to make a living, I'd have to write novels.
Yeah. What when you pitch your novels, how much I'm not super familiar with that whole process. Are you pitching whole drafts or just is it just sort of like synopsis? That I'm super curious about, yeah, what that looks like for you.
Well, that's a good question. Usually nonfiction is pitched from a proposal.
Okay.
A book proposal, it's standard, like it's usually 20 to 30 page proposal with sample chapters, competing title analysis. That's nonfiction.
Okay.
Fiction, though, usually is sold from a complete manuscript, unless, this book is in demand. Like, if, say if somebody writes a book that does really well in the industry and, you know, sells really well, uh, then, sometimes publishers will buy what's called a partial, meaning a partial manuscript. But usually, publishers don't buy a partial because why buy a partial when you can just wait for the whole thing?
Right.
So because there's, a lot of just like Hollywood, the film industry, publishing has become quite risk averse,
Mm.
but in a different way to Hollywood, in my experience. It's easier now than it's ever been to get published, but it's harder to make a living and a career as a writer because whereas, you might get your book published, it's unlikely that the publisher, will put any real, financial sort of power into publicizing it. So it's
Okay.
almost like going to the riverbank, with 40, 50 fishing poles instead of 10 and putting all 50 in the water. And wherever the fish go, that's where you throw crumbs. That's where you put all your resources.
Got it.
And so then those one or two books, those one or two fishing poles that are getting all the fish, they sort of cover all the others that aren't.
Okay.
Whereas, I prefer to work with somebody who probably has fewer fishing poles in the water, but there's much more effort put into each one.
Got it. Okay. That makes sense. And did that kind of come along with like the role of social media and like expecting authors to have like this big following before they get book deals and stuff like that? Is that part of it or is it kind of different
Yeah, I
than
think
that?
that's part of it, but also I think part of it is that also part of it is that people are, readers are compete, writers are competing now with social media and streaming TV. So, somebody will be reading and the phone will be like, and then they'll like look over and they're distracted. Or they'll, I hear people all the time, writers talking about some show they're watching on Hulu or I don't know, Max. And so, they talk about books, but they also talk about TV.
Yeah.
So it's sort of a golden age of streaming television, and which is interesting. But so I think that writers have to be crafty and they have to really kind of rework some of the front end of the novel so that they really, really grab the reader and pull the reader in. So if your phone buzzes, you're like, oh, go away,
Yeah.
because you find out, you're reading this book. So I think that it's an opportunity for writers to really like dial down on their craft. But some writers feel like the obligation is with the reader. The reader should like this. The reader should. But I think that's very dangerous territory because it's a little bit, hubristic. So, I say to readers, like, come on, we're competing with all these. Let's do this. You've got the talent. Why not? You can do it. Don't settle. So I just push and push and push as a book editor.
Yeah. What I love about that is, right, it puts the responsibility on yourself
Yeah.
to create
Right.
something better. Do you still have time to read, or since you write so much and by the end of writing, do you kind of feel like, okay, I'm wordsed out right now. I need to do something else, or are you still able to?
No, I have to read, or I'm unable to write. So if I'm traveling a lot, on tour in Europe or China or here in the US, and I'm just not having time to read, I know that when I get back to my desk, I'm going to have to spend 1 or 2 weeks just intensively reading. So what happens is, the Tuesday through Friday, 8 to noon when I write, if I'm not writing anything that's very good, or that I'm happy with, I'll just spend those 4 hours reading.
Mm.
So I think when you spend 4 hours a day, 4 days a week, reading for 2 weeks, like it does something to you. It's like meditating for like 4 hours a day. So after those 2 weeks, like I'm ready to like, I just can't not write. I just feel so, so reading gives you the energy, the fuel. It's like protein powder for bodybuilders. I mean, but here's the caveat if you're not reading in something, if you're not reading a book, you have to read books you love. Because the thing is, I think a lot of people have a high tolerance for reading things they're not really that into.
Mm.
Like being in a relationship with someone who you're just perpetually, both of you are perpetually unsatisfied. Like leave, get out of the relationship. It's the same with a book. I think that kind of indifference and that passivity is enormously dangerous to a young writer. So I only read books that I'm really, really loving.
Do you
So I'm,
have, oh,
I'm
sorry.
always inspired by what I'm reading because I start about 50 books a year
Okay.
and I finish about 12 to 15.
Okay.
So I read the first 15 pages, and if I'm not loving it, it goes. Even if later on I might love that book,
Mm.
at this moment, it's not for me. It's not saying it's a bad book, it's just saying it's not the right fit at that time. So I just sometimes I have a pile of 30 books and I'll just go through all of them and not find a single book that I love. And then
Mm.
I'll get another 30. And then usually I'll find out of 60, I'll usually find a couple of books that I love enough to read the whole thing. And then so I'm only reading things I love.
Do you have books that you return to for inspiration?
Yeah. The work of Michael McClaverty, and Raymond Carver and Flannery O'Connor.
Okay. Do you
Um,
have any specific ones that you recommend of their work?
just their short stories.
Okay, cool.
And Michael McClaverty, anything by him inspires me because he's my favorite writer.
Okay. Okay. I'll
He's
have
out
to
of he's out of print, so you have to find his work on eBay.
oh, okay. Okay. Yeah, I'll have to check him out. I've actually never heard of him before, so
No, no one has. I mean, because he's forgotten, and I'm
mm,
I'm going to try and bring him back into print as his. I'm going to try and somehow bring him into print in the US. Um, as a book editor, and if I ever get into the publishing world formally,
Yeah.
I'd like to be a publisher and a book editor because I feel like there's certain writers and styles of writing that I really want to put out there, for people. I've got my favorite living writers who are, if I ever like came into like tens of millions, I would literally offer them massive amounts of money to come to my publishing house if I had one.
Yeah.
I have my stable of like who I consider to be the greatest living writers. That's like a dream.
Yeah. Who are some of the people that you're really excited about their writing?
Anne Michaels,
Okay.
Canadian writer, Claire Keegan, and there's a couple of young writers who are sort of coming up the ranks
Yeah.
who I think are very special if they can. But I feel like, writers might disagree, but I think to be a great writer, you have to be managed. You have
Mm.
to have management in the same way that I thought just if you're a great writer, your destiny is sealed. But the older I get, I realize that I don't think that's true.
Mm.
Look at F. Scott Fitzgerald and Thomas Wolfe, they had Max Perkins as their editor. Kent Harif had Gary Fishkajan as his editor. Do you see what I mean? So, and
Yeah.
someone else had T.S. Eliot as their editor. So I really feel like there's writers now who are writing who I think are the world's greatest living writers. But when I read their books, I see that could have been cut, that could have been developed. So I really feel like, fair play to their editors. I'm not talking about Anne Michaels or Claire.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah.
I'm talking about I'm talking about other writers I won't name. But I feel like if I was their editor, I feel like I could take them to the next level.
Yeah. Yeah. That's a really good point because I think um people don't realize how much of sort of a team thing a book
Yeah.
is, where it looks like it's one person's thing, but you go through, well, it's, a lot of people, it's the beta readers and the editors and the publishers. Like, do you feel like there's
Yeah.
a lot of, do you feel like that's accurate and that like your
Yeah.
books have a lot of people behind them too?
Absolutely. There are so many stories about writers who, they say this book wouldn't have be the way it is if it wasn't for my editor.
Mm,
I feel like editors, while they don't create anything, a good editor will have the profound ability to let more of you into the
mm,
book, to let more of to recognize what your particular talent is and your particular genius is with language and story, and to just help you reveal more of it. Even if the writer like pushes back, and writers often do, because they get attached to just bizarre passages and sequences randomly. Who knows why? But I feel like a good editor will really coax out and push
mm.
writers to the point, to just the limit of their ability.
Yeah.
Um, but the last thing you do is you want to push and you hear this pop.
Yeah.
So, but I really feel like the older I get, the more I realize that editors are really, really important in a writer's career, and that a writer, look at Proust.
Yeah.
His work is brilliant, but it's just really, really overwritten in a way. I read 60 pages of Proust to get maybe a couple of pages that are just pure genius.
Yes.
Um, so if Proust had had somebody to manage him. I know this sounds, other people might be saying that's ridiculous, but we'll never know, of course.
Right.
And then you've got like Ulysses by
Mm.
Joyce. Could that book have been edited a bit more? While there's certain things that could have happened. Virginia Woolf said that it's good, but it's also infuriating. And that's how I feel about it. And Finnegan's Way, could we have
Mm.
had a compromise there?
Yeah, right.
Really, I love it, but also I'm incredibly annoyed by it.
Yeah. Right. The wordplay, absolute genius, the puns, the level he's working at, but yeah, it
Must,
is not an
must
accessible.
couldn't have be built a bridge. Couldn't we have
Right.
had,
That's a really good point. Do you have beta readers and things like that, or are you strictly working with like one editor on your stuff?
Yeah, I work with one editor, and a lot of writers I know, if their editor leaves the house or goes into private something else, then often the writer will actually pay that editor to read their work out of their own pocket,
Mm.
and then they'll just turn the book in clean. to their publisher. Or
Okay.
they'll say to the publisher, yeah, I'll work with you, but will you pay this person to be my editor? I'm sure publishers, they're good at business. They'll figure something out. Maybe it's better for them not to have someone to pay health benefits to, a consultancy fee. But, if a publisher wants a book bad enough, they will concede to a writer's. And also, I think publishers like it, that kind of loyalty,
Mm,
being an editor. You want a relationship with your editor where you're not afraid to email them.
yeah.
Every time you speak to them, you feel great. You don't feel nervous and like lost at sea. Do you see what I mean? Like,
Yeah.
sometimes, you'll speak to someone and after the phone call, you'll feel sort of like nervous and
Mm,
demoralized. Well, that's the opposite of what you should feel after talking to your editor. You know,
yeah. When what advice would you give to so people who don't have like a relationship with a publisher or anything and they're like thinking about self-publishing or anything like that?
Hmm.
Do you recommend everybody and I'm sure it varies from person to person, right? But just as a blanket statement, do you recommend that people who are working to self-publish work with editors or like beta readers or like what I guess what would you say the
Editor.
difference could be? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, the thing is, this is the thing. Like, when you are ready to work with an editor, if you send them something and then you look at it again in the time that they've got it, and then you're like, oh, and then you change things, and then you send them something and say, hey, can you use this version?
Mm,
You're not ready to work with an editor. It should be that you work on something, you don't touch it for 2 weeks, you look at it again, and you don't change a single thing
mm,
because nothing you can do. You're at the limit of what you can do. And that's when you work with an editor. Now, how do you find an editor? That's the big question. There are lots of people out there for hire, but how do you find the right fit? Well, my advice is look at who are your favorite living readers.
mm,
I mean, writers. Sorry, who are your favorite living
yeah.
writers? So, I know who mine are, say my top five. And if I was looking for an editor, I might write to them and say, I have written a book and I'd like to pay you to read it and just give me comments. You don't have to edit it. I just want whatever you're comfortable with. Um, and then what'll happen is, half of the people won't write to you because they don't want to offend you by saying they don't do that. And a couple of them will say, actually, I'll do that, and this is my fee.
Mm,
And then you'll be like, great, you'll save up, and you'll can't believe you're working with your favorite writer.
yeah.
And the confidence working with them, and they might be a good editor. They'll get, if they've edited their books enough
Yeah.
to be published, then they know what they're doing more than you do. So not you, Alex, but I mean one in general,
Yeah, yeah.
or French. And so uh, or what will happen is, like for instance, Claire Keegan gives workshops.
Okay.
I know she's giving one like a 3 or 4 day workshop in Ireland and room and board and everything. It's at some kind of conference center. And it's like, I don't know, 1,500, 1,600 bucks plus your flight to Ireland. So if you're really serious about writing, I mean, 2,600 dollars, you can come up with that.
Hmm.
Even if have you've to like, bust your bottom in Taco Bell.
Hmm.
I'd do it. I did it to get money to do
Yeah.
stuff. So, and it's all good experience as a
Yeah.
writer. So, yeah, often you'll find that also your favorite writers do actually give workshops or they teach in MFA programs. And if that's the case, then there's a good chance then that you may get a scholarship because that teacher will be like, yeah, this is somebody I want to work with. Let's see what money we have in the university to get them here. So the key is don't just look up randomly an editor on the internet. Take your top 10 favorite writers, see if they give workshops or if you can hire them. Because sometimes a writer might be between books.
Yeah.
They want to they need a couple of $1,000s to pay the rent. Your favorite writer needs somebody to pay the rent, and then you come along. I mean, this is not new.
Yeah.
Look at Samuel Beckett. He worked with James Joyce.
Wow. I did not know that. That's awesome.
Yeah. And Beckett begged Joyce to be his editor to work with him. And this is when Beckett was just this kid.
Yeah.
Nobody knew this is Samuel Beckett. He's just a guy who wants to work. So it happens a lot. It happens a lot in music and happens a lot in painting as well.
Okay.
So don't seek out an editor, seek out someone whose work you already admire. That's how
Okay.
that's how I work with people, is that they write to me and say, I'm writing my third book and I just read I will, and then that's how so I don't advertise. Usually people will write to me because of my work, and then we're usually a good fit.
Yeah, right, because they like your work and so naturally perhaps
Yeah,
the styles align.
exactly.
Okay, that
Yeah.
makes sense. Do you ever work with people who their style is nothing like yours at all to the point where it's a little bit more challenging than usual? Have you ever experienced that as an editor?
Yeah, sometimes. And usually what I do is I give them a manuscript report. So I'll read their book and then I'll give them like a 10, 20 page report about structure, pacing, character, how they can develop it. And I do probably five or six of those a year. And everyone at the end, my goal is for every writer at the end of it to feel enthusiastic, to feel confident, and to feel like they have this path ahead of them, which will get them to where they want to be with the book.
Okay.
So, but in terms of like writing, working with a writer one on one every month, usually, it has to be something that I, if I was a publisher, that I would publish.
Gotcha. Right. That makes sense to, yeah, have the connection and be able to provide that.
Yeah.
That's awesome. A few more questions here and then we'll end everything.
Sure.
Um what do you hope that people experience or feel or think when they come into contact with your work? Like if you had to think about, okay, this is what I would love for people to experience. Do you feel like there's something?
Yeah, I'd like them to feel less alone.
Hmm.
And I'd like people to feel, how when you go out and you buy a new outfit and you put it on for the first time and you feel like kind of good.
Yeah.
That's how I want people to feel.
Okay.
Like I
Yeah.
want them to feel like they're more in touch with their own lives now.
Okay. Is there, and then another question, what are just some things, doesn't have to be like your favorite things or anything like that. What are some things that have inspired you lately, whether it's films or books that you've just read or things that you've seen or art?
I'm reading Virginia Woolf's diary at the moment, which is really good because
Okay.
she says things like, I just went to this book party and I wore like black clothes, but they were cheap. So I'm worried that like I looked ugly. And maybe if Mrs. D sells, I'll get myself a new dress. Mrs. D is Mrs. Dalloway.
Yes.
And then she writes in one of them, she's like, I can't believe it. Mrs. D has sold 1,000 copies. Like, I can't believe this. So she talks about Mrs. D and she calls, and to the lighthouse, she just calls lighthouse.
Wow.
And so she's writing about, she's like, I'm only writing an hour a day at the moment. She says, because I'm getting these bad headaches but and then she's like, I've just spent 3 hours working on the waves, and I've realized it's terrible, and now I'm going to have to go back and redo all these sections. So it's like, and then she's writing about, how much the bad reviews hurt. So, and then she's writing about like, I'm going to London for a couple of days, it's Ray. So it's like, but this is Virginia Woolf, but she doesn't realize she's Virginia Woolf.
That's so inspiring. Yeah, to see somebody who we would consider legendary, he's just experiencing the same stuff that we do.
Exactly right. Like, she's like wondering what people will think of Mrs. D. You know, Leonard says it's like my best work, but that I toy with the characters. So it's really interesting. Reading writers' diaries is really interesting because you see like they were just really just the same as us.
Yeah.
Um,
Okay. That's awesome. Is there anything else that
I love
you
driving fast cars as well.
driving? Okay. Yeah.
I
What
really
kind?
love driving like really fast, like Porsche or like,
Oh,
Maserati, McLaren. Like I really like borrowing a car,
yeah.
maybe going to a track, and I really like driving fast. I think, and I also play video games.
Okay.
And I think again, I said, I think there's something wrong with me, and I think that need for like
Hmm.
really explosive stimulation.
Yeah.
Like when I'm playing a video game, like I die in the first 3 seconds
Yeah.
because I jump out, with my lance. I do, and it's got to be like, in Braveheart, there's that guy who runs down the mountain first and gets immediately killed. Like that would be me. So I've got this need for just this explosive, like need for like really stimulation, and
Okay.
in video games and driving on a track or like,
Yeah.
you see what I mean? Or like
Yeah.
rock climbing, well, like rappelling. Rock climbing's a bit.
Cool. Okay.
Even, if I could buy dynamite, I'd probably buy some. Like drive it out to the country, Pennsylvania, and just like blow something up.
Oh,
Um, but so I think that I have to get that out of my system so that I can sit down and settle to write.
wow. Yeah. That's a really good point. And we can end here. What how do you find that balance between like what you just said, like the stimulating things in life and going out and doing things and then writing? Because I feel like there needs to be a balance because if you sit down and write all the time, you don't have as much inspiration. But
Yeah.
then, if you're truly a writer, you can't just go out and do stuff and then never write. Like how do you navigate that? Do you find it just naturally happens?
No, you have to manage it. So being a writer, you have to accept the fact that you can't just be one person. You
Mm,
can't be a writer all the time. So for instance, some days you'll be a runner and an athlete. Other
mm,
days you'll be like a designer. You know, Other days you'll be like a couch potato. Other days you'll be a cook.
yeah.
You're baking recipes and you'll feel like a cook. But at the end of the day, you always come home to writing. But some young writers feel like they have to be the writer all the time,
Oh,
drifting in and out of diners with a book in their pocket and wandering about thinking of Keats. And you see what I mean? But the thing is, it's impossible to sustain that all the time. You just can't be a writer all the time because then when you sat down to write, you'd be drained of all the energy that you
yeah.
need to. So if you want to be a champion surfer, you know what I mean? You can do it and be a writer. There's this idea that we have to define ourselves as narrowly as possible. I'm this, I'm working finance, I'm a lawyer, I'm a writer, I'm like an athlete, and that's all rubbish. I mean, if you look at the soldiers in World War II, the RAF pilots, you know, they were in their Spitfires, they were like hardened soldiers. But when they weren't, they were like wearing silk scarves and like reading French poetry and wearing like, you see what I mean? You don't have to be one thing. But I think it's an American obsession to just
Mm,
define oneself as narrowly as possible. Like, I'm a Steelers fan, I'm this, I'm that, you know what I mean? But really, you just have to be comfortable with the idea that you have many selves and you have to feed each one. And the more you feed each one, the more it will empower the other ones.
that's such good advice. Oh, I love that. Simon, thank you so much for coming on here. It was an honor to
Pleasure.
speak with you and I really appreciate all the things that you shared. It was awesome.
Thanks for asking, Alex. I appreciate the opportunity and good luck, my friend. Onwards.